Today I'm going to talk to you guys about Flexbox. And to do that, we're going to cover the axis, direction, alignment, gap, and order. Then we're going to take a look at another example for wrapping. And then after that, we'll talk about flex spaces, grow, and shrink. And after we talk about those things, you'll have just about everything you need to work with Flexbox for just about any layout. So first, let's start with the axis. We're going to start off by making a flex container. And then inside of that, we'll do 3 child items. And we'll number them. And next, we're going to style those. So we have our flex container, which we're going to give a display flex. And I'm also going to give it a background color and a height, just to make it a little easier to see what we're looking at. Now, for these examples, I'm using SAS to make it a little easier. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to nest the child element, and we're going to go ahead and style it a little bit. So we're going to start out with a width of 20%. We'll give it a little height, a background color, lime green, a border, and I'll also make that font size a little bigger just to make it a little easier to read. Great. So now that we've got those base styles, we can start talking about the axis. So Flex gives us a few new properties. You're either going to see Flex direction or Flex flow in examples that you look up. These are the same, but Flex flow is shorthand, and it lets you do a little more, which we'll talk about a little later. The default value, though, for flex direction is row, which is what we're seeing now. Setting the direction to row on our flex container isn't going to change anything. Our items are in a row, and that main axis, if you can imagine, is skewering through our items horizontally. Let's set our flex direction to column now. Now everything's stacked and our main axis is now skewering our items vertically. We can also reverse our column, or we can reverse our row. So let's change it back to column. This property is really helpful because it makes it really easy for us to make things responsive. So taking a mobile first approach, we would want these things stacked, right, in a column like we have. Let's inline a media query here for when our screen size gets above 600 pixels. And when we get above that and hit desktop mode, we're going to go from a column to row. And if we pull our viewport over, we can see that change. We might want to also modify the width of our child elements. So on mobile, we would want the items to be wider. So we can inline another media query in our child. And this time, we'll make the items 20% wide when it hits the desktop mode. But when we're on mobile, we'll go bigger. Next, we need to talk about alignment. The new properties for this are justify content, and this property will align your content with the main axis. So when we're in direction row, justify content center will center our items on the main axis horizontally. But when we're in flex direction column, that is going to center our items vertically. Our other property is align items. This will align our items on the cross axis instead of the main axis. So when we're in row, the align items will vertically align our items. So there we go, vertically centering our div. In column, we'll see that it's horizontally centering. The default value for both of these properties is flex start, which is left aligned on row, or the top if you're in column. If we were to go flex end, that will go to the bottom or to the right when we're in row. You can also use space between, space around, or space evenly. For now, we'll space evenly, and then we can vertically center our content with align item center. And now that we know how to align things horizontally and vertically with flex, we can do that to our child elements. Display, flex, justify content, center, and align items center. And we have perfectly centered content. Let's say that we didn't want to space this out evenly. When we align center on our justified content, we have no white space in between our items. And you might not like that. So let's give our items some white space. We can do that with a gap property. So I can give it 20 pixels gap, and what this will do is it will give it gap of 20 here. This is shorthand, actually, for both row gap and column gap. So for instance, we can do that same thing like this, with our row gap coming first and our column gap coming second. But let's just make the gap 20 pixels. And our final new property here to talk about is order. So let's go down here and let's target a child int of type 1, 2, and 3. And we'll use the order to swap out the order. 1 is going to be second. The second child is going to be first. And the third child is going to be third. So now we can see that our second item is in the first spot. Our first item is in the second spot, and our last item is in the third spot. So that covers the axis, direction, alignment, gap, and order. So let's move on to wrapping items. This is really important for when you're working with dynamically generated content. Think like an e-commerce store with products. So let's create a new Flex container 2 and give it 7 child items. And we'll number them. And then we'll need to go up here and style that Flex container 2. Again, quick background, height, and of course, the Flex property. And we'll also style the child with 20%, height, 100 pixels, background, lime green, border, 2px solid black, and we'll give it that bigger font size again. And then we'll give it the justify content center align items center to quickly center our content within that child. All right. And on the Flex container 2 this time, we're going to add a new property. This property is flex wrap. By default, this is set to no wrap, which you can see over here. We have 20%, but that's not working out. We should only get 5 on each row, and it's squashing 40% more into 100 than it should be able to. So when we change that from no wrap to wrap, we'll see those items start wrapping. Now, again, our justify content is going to align us horizontally, and that is set to flex start by default. I'm going to add it just to reinforce that idea. And now we're going to use a slightly different property than we did before. Before we used align items, which is good for taking no wrap item things like one single row. But this time we have multiple rows because the items wrap. So this is exactly what align content is for. It will align our rows instead of the items in our rows. So we can center them, or we can put them at the start. Now we can play with alignment further. We can center things or reverse them. But I found that this is the most common scenario when you are using the wrap property. One final note before moving on is that you can set the wrap and direction at once with flex flow. So replace those properties like this. So if we were to have flex direction row and flex wrap, and then we can change those out. And set them both in one property, which is pretty cool. Finally, we're going to move on to our last example, which is where we'll cover flex spaces, grow, and shrink. Just like last time, we're going to create another flex container, and this time it'll be called 3. And we'll put children in it, this time instead of 7, just 3. But this time we're going to give them all a little bit different content. So number 1, 2, and box 3. Just like last time, we're going to come up here and we're going to style our flex container 3. With the background, height, and display flex. Then we're going to grab some of this stuff here from this child and copy it down into here. One thing I'd like to note really quick is that I have set a max width on the body of this document to 800 pixels. I did that up here at the top. That's important. We're going to set the width of our child to 100 pixels. And you can see that each one of them is taking 100 pixels. We can tell our child elements to grow to meet the flex container width. And we do that by setting flex grow to 1. Each one of these items has grown an equal amount past that starting value to grow it into this container. That default value is usually 0, so they don't grow by default. Let's change the width of just one of those items to 300. And we'll see the flex just sort of figures it out. Let's set them all to 300. Remember, our max width is 800 pixels. So it's not going to look any different because it won't overflow. Because it's growing to the size of the container, which is a perfect introduction to flex shrink. Flex shrink is what prevents that overflow. By default, it's set to 1. We can turn the overflow off by setting it to 0. This allows us to break out of that max width. All right, let's get rid of that. And this too. And let's move on to flex basis. All items are given a flex basis default of auto. This will use the item's specified width. So let's go back to 100. We'll see that it's using that 100 width. If we don't have a width, then it will be as wide as the content inside the elements. So rather than setting an explicit width on our items, like 33.33 for 3 items, we can change the flex basis from auto to 0. And then we can set flex grow along with it to 1. And this tells it that we want to equally grow our content. If we change the direction, then we'll be affecting height instead of width. Finally, there's a shorthand for all of this too. You can set flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis all at once with flex. So we set grow to 1, shrink to its default 1, and basis to 0. This is the same as what we just did. And that's it. With those properties, you should be able to manipulate and recreate just about any layout you can think of with Flexbox. I find that the best way to practice this is to try taking things that you've already built and recreating them with Flexbox. One layout that this is really good for is footers, because oftentimes you have a lot of columns and rows, and then they need to do something a little bit different when you go from mobile to desktop. So it's a really good place to practice combining all of these properties and nesting Flexbox layouts within each other. Anyway, if this video helped you, please hit the like button or leave a comment what you'd like me to cover next. See ya!